begin. The first one is that if you have a cell phone or smartphone, don't turn it off, actually, but put it to silent. You know, every once in a while, if you want to tweet, I'm at #SkylightBooks. You can do that, and we'd love that, actually. And just say, you know, I'm here with Susan and Andrew at #SkylightBooks. So also, we have some really terrific people who will be coming to the store in the next few months. Way in the fall, we'll have author A.M. Holmes here in October. We're going to have Charles Yu here next month. We're going to have the fine artist Ry Rockland here next month. So it should be loads and loads of fun. All right, so sign up on our website. Sign up so you can get our monthly newsletter. Also, just to let you know that we are here for you. If you've never been here, I want you to know that to please visit our space next door, which is more architecture, fashion, photography, graphic novels there. Okay, so just know that. We're very excited about the evening tonight. I'm always excited when I hear about Los Angeles, because this is my town. The way the evening will work is that Andrew Diener will go first, and then Susan Phillips. They'll read for about 15 or talk about 15, 20 minutes, and then we'll do a Q&A afterward. So, a little bit about Andrew Diener. That's exactly right. Exactly right. See, a little fan club. People screaming already. I just mentioned your name. Something I know about Andrew is that his father is here because he was the first one to show us, says, can I buy 2 books? Okay, good dad, good dad. That's good dad. That Andrew Diener is an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Connecticut, and this is what Mike Davis, author of City of Quartz, Excavating the Future in Los Angeles, said. In this tour de force of dialectical observation, Andrew Diener explains how Venice Beach is both LA's democratic libido and the summation of its inequalities. I read that sentence like 10 times. Okay, so, you know, and you can read it over and over again when you buy the book. So, but ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Andrew Diener.
When a friend of mine saw that quote, he refuted it and said that he was the democratic libido of Los Angeles. He wasn't so certain that the book was, that Venice Beach was. I'm going to start by just reading a little bit from the introduction, just a couple of pages, and then I will kind of dissect some of those themes and talk a little bit more about how some of these things work in Venice and in Los Angeles more generally. Nestled between Santa Monica and Marina del Rey along the Los Angeles coast, Venice is a vibrant community where contrasts between cultures and classes are seemingly everywhere. Most think of it as a quirky beach town, an enclave for artists, beatniks, and hippies, and visitors from near and far come to its boardwalk, one of the most eclectic and iconoclastic public spaces in California. Yet Venice also has so many elements that make urban living attractive: racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic diversity, artistic and architectural creativity, interesting commercial amenities ranging from the boardwalk's raucous vending culture to the restaurants, coffee shops, and boutiques and other nearby commercial strips. And it has residents consumed by a spirited political dialogue about its future. Venice represents the dynamism and contradictions that diversity brings. It reveals the cultural richness and creative nuances that emerge when people seek out proximity to differences, but it also shows that even as individuals of different backgrounds idealize diversity as a concept, inequalities and conflict are a persistent thorn in the pursuit of a new age of neighborhood integration. Widely hailed as a Southern California bastion of liberal culture and politics, Venice is a community divided. I'm going to present a bit of a tour of Venice to get you situated in the scene itself. We begin our tour on the Venice Boardwalk, formerly known as Oceanfront Walk, where the Pacific Ocean is directly to the west and the Santa Monica Mountains are in our distant view to the north. The former site of lively beatnik cafes and kosher bakeries during the decades between 1950 and 1970, the boardwalk has become a world-renowned tourist destination with a unique commercial identity. On any given day, up to 200 people set up shop on the beach side of the boardwalk in a rent-free vending economy that they call the free speech zone. While most cloak their sales and performances with some element of free speech, incorporating some artistic, religious, or political emblem, they blur the boundaries between this presentation and economic ambitions. An African-American artist with chin-length dreadlocks, who has been homeless on and off for 4 decades, preaches about his display of shattered television screens, painted over with the phrase, "Axis of Evil." He sells color-copied prints of paintings of the boardwalk scenery. Curious about the peppery scent of burning sage, tourists listen to a tall, lanky black man with a silver beard peddle the herb tied in bundles, promising them that burning it like incense will ultimately rid their homes of demons. A middle-aged Asian artist strains to express his point in English to a white teenage girl posing for her portrait, with posters labeled "Chinese paintings for sale" stacked beside him. A Latina woman in her mid-20s, originally from Mexico City, beads jewelry on hemp, adding a crucifix to each piece. A large crowd gathers around a Salvadoran man who walks shirtless and barefoot, with a woman sitting on his shoulders over the crushed remains of hundreds of glass bottles, with each step leaving behind blood-stained footprints on the concrete. The crowd, enthralled by his performance, throws dollar bills into a straw hat. The mob packing into the boardwalk divides the informal economic attachments from the formal ones. Opposite the free speech zone are beach bungalows, weather-worn apartment buildings, shiny multi-level loft and condominium developments, as well as rent-paying businesses where one can buy a $2 coffee or a $5 sandwich, get a tattoo, cheap sunglasses, or a touristy t-shirt. Some residents, store owners, and landlords complain to the police about competition over vending spaces and noise from amplified music coming from the free speech zone. Rent-paying business owners object to those on the rent-free side selling similar products as the ones that they carry in their stores. Police officers move up and down the boardwalk on foot, by bicycle, or in slowly maneuvering cars and SUVs through the masses, trying to mediate between these competing interests. We walk toward the northern end of the boardwalk and stop at the corner of Rose Avenue. In the mid-'80s, a homeless tent city took over this section of the beach, leading to an intense conflict between residents and homeless activists. The tent city is long gone, but hidden behind a string of vendors are dozens of people sleeping on a grassy mound shaded by towering palm trees. If we return the next day, this group may have suddenly disappeared, the outcome of a homeless sweep. Awakened by LAPD officers at 5 o'clock a.m., many are hauled away to jail, only to return the following week to begin accumulating their modest possessions from scratch. If we continue up Rose Avenue, away from the boardwalk, homelessness is even more pronounced, differentiating this section as a separate neighborhood. Lining Rose and its intersecting streets are dozens of rundown RVs. Those who live in them are outside talking with friends, many who live directly on the streets without a vehicle, some smoking hand-rolled cigarettes, others smoking pot. Several homeless men and women stand on the corner, watching a parade of tourists park their cars and saunter toward the beach. A few in a far worse state of mind appear disconnected from their surroundings and hold elaborate conversations with themselves. They rummage through trash cans, picking apart styrofoam packages to look for intact leftovers. One woman, with thinning, disheveled hair, wildly yells at a man walking by, showing off her missing teeth with each insult. A burly man with a dark brown beard, ragged trucker's hat, and broken sunglasses held together by masking tape politely asks pedestrians for money. And others bury themselves under blankets on the sidewalks of less trafficked streets perpendicular to Rose. Walking inland from the beach along Rose Avenue, a right turn on 7th Avenue takes us to another distinct neighborhood that locals call Oakwood. We pass by one of 5 historically black churches, the First Baptist Church, with roots dating back to the early 1900s. when Venice was first developed and the earliest African Americans moved in. Across from the church is a park, the Oakwood Park, that operates as the neighborhood center, marked by a sign honoring a one-time influential African American activist, one of the many visible tributes to the black community in Oakwood. On the northern end of the park, retired African American men sit at picnic tables playing dominoes and reminiscing about the way things used to be. Younger black men in their 20s and 30s congregate by a fence near the picnic tables, listening to music played from cars parked in the street. One of the young men moves away from the group toward a slow-moving vehicle driven by a middle-aged white man and holds a small bag out in the open during daylight hours without even trying to disguise his action. After making an exchange, the car speeds off and he returns to his friends. Formerly part of a massive operation on many street corners throughout Oakwood, the drug distribution ring has been steadily pushed by LAPD officers into the vicinity of the park, where surveillance cameras now monitor every move. Only a few of the young men actually engage in illicit activities, but the friendships between dealers and non-dealers have complicated histories, as many grew up together in Oakwood, and family members have known each other for decades. On the opposite end of the park, a different type of lawlessness takes place. Newer residents, white men and women in their 30s and 40s, let their dogs run off their leashes, disregarding a city ordinance that restricts this activity and runs at cross purposes with the interests of older residents whose children and grandchildren use the park to play. With the exception of the park and its immediate surroundings, Oakwood streets are very quiet. Occasionally we pass individuals, couples, and families walking on the sidewalks. African American women, many of them seniors, sit outside small and simple but neatly organized homes in which multiple generations of family members have lived. Latina women wait with their children outside a grocery truck with fresh fruits and vegetables for sale, making friendly banter with the driver who only speaks Spanish. White women push vibrant colored designer baby strollers across the street without breaking stride in order to avoid an African American homeless man stumbling toward them from a desolate alleyway. If we walk on 7th toward California, a right turn brings us to Abbot Kinney Boulevard, a diagonal retail artery that runs through the center of Venice and operates as a clear neighborhood boundary. A local coffee shop called Abbot's Habit is on the corner. Opened in the 80s, it is one of the quote-unquote old spots on the street where gray-haired hippies, sunglass-wearing hipsters, as well as up-and-coming professionals in the industry, that is the entertainment business, all make use of this small social space, one of the few remaining integrative spots on the street. At one time, Abbot Kinney Boulevard was the site of African American community organizations, left-wing political groups, artist studios, thrift stores, abandoned lots, and graffiti-covered buildings. In recent years, it has become filled with high-end shops and eateries. Successful artists who live in Venice and have lived there for decades meet in the evenings at Hal's Bar and Grill, a longtime local favorite. Closer to Main Street, people from all over Los Angeles flock to a strip of expensive restaurants giving rise to the label Restaurant Row. Strolling along, we witness people parking hybrid cars, getting ready to shop at trendy boutiques and antique furniture stores. Some are donning the latest designer fashions, $200 skinny jeans, $350 oversized sunglasses, and one woman drapes a $3,000 bag over her forearm, large enough to fit her toy dog. Others purposely present themselves as beach bums and bohemians wearing ripped jeans, flannel shirts, flip-flops, and fedoras. Regardless of how they stage themselves, they walk in and out of upscale stores.
Nice.
Yeah, use that.
Just because the mic's coming down.
Sometimes spending much more money on lavish items than it seems they can afford from the way they dress. I'm going to stop the tour there. There are other sections that I can get to, the canals, and return back to the boardwalk. But I just want to talk a little bit about what some of these themes reflect in a larger picture of what Venice is and how it's related to the city of Los Angeles. Since the 1970s, I don't think it's really a secret that Venice has been undergoing gentrification. It's the term that everybody throws around. But what do we mean by that term, and how does it work in relationship to a place that has such a dramatic sense of diversity across race, ethnicity, and class? The basic definition is the influx of wealthier people into a neighborhood that they wouldn't have lived in previously, often leading to the displacement of older residents. Certainly, that happens in Venice to some degree, and it has for about 40 years. But it doesn't tell us very much about how gentrification might work or what it means to the people who live in those neighborhoods and have been forced out. Gentrification is basically, I argue, many different things at the same time, and it changes the way a place looks and feels. The reason I wanted to start the book with a tour was to give you a sense of what things look like and what they feel. I call this the neighborhood public culture. There's something public about culture, about the visibility of it, about what you can see that gives you a sense of whether you belong or whether you don't. With gentrification, we see the influx. Some visible elements are the influx of new residents who offer different daily routines or find value in different things. For example, housing aesthetics. They build houses that look different than the previous residents. They pay more attention to certain brands or styles. They have different interpretations of the meaning of community, and they engage in political action in a very different way. It's subtle but different. Old-time residents would engage politics by going directly to the source. In the 1990s, in the Oakwood section, historically a segregated African-American neighborhood, Latinos started to move in, and over time there were some confrontations between the different ethnic groups, leading to some major violence, gang violence in the 90s. The way of dealing with that gang violence was to intervene directly, go directly to the source, talk to people who were selling drugs on the streets, talk to people who were committing violence. Many of the residents who had been there for decades knew the people committing crimes. So they went right there to those people and said, you know, we don't want you doing this here. Don't do it in front of my house. Move another block or stop it altogether, and don't bring in young people into this. There was a direct intervention, and that was historically how it was done. And the reason it was done that way is because the police wouldn't come to the neighborhood. If there was a serious problem over decades, African Americans lived in Oakwood since the early 1900s, and they called the police didn't show up. So the solutions were often group-based. Let's see if we can get it done. When new groups moved in, there were new forms of intervention. People started to call the police more. People called their politicians, their city councilmen more. They called city attorneys more. They helped to orchestrate and implement a gang injunction in the Venice area against the 3 gangs that were active there. In addition to this, right, developers have become more active, implementing a whole new visible symbolic code, condominium conversions, much larger houses over time. Also new retail and restaurants. Abbot Kinney Boulevard used to be called West Washington Boulevard. It was a place of cross-cultural contact. It had thrift stores, rundown buildings. Bohemian groups settled there and organized. The left-wing political rag, the Free Venice Beachhead, was started and organized on Abbot Kinney Boulevard. Then it was West Washington Boulevard. The Peace and Freedom Party started on West Washington Boulevard as well. There were teen centers for African American youth. There were all sorts of mixing that was going on the street. Over time, it became much trendier. Recently, GQ magazine labeled Abbot Kinney Boulevard as the trendiest block in the United States. Just to give you a sense, right? But this doesn't exist in a bubble, right? Gentrification doesn't exist in a bubble. We tend to think, well, something new is happening and all these new people are moving into a neighborhood. Well, it's completely changing the fabric of the community and changing the look and feel, but it's more complicated than that. History is very odd that way, actually. All different things happen at different periods and continue to impact the current situation, right? They have these kind of paths that they take, right? For example, African American segregation. If you were to look at the history of black segregation in Los Angeles, places like Watts, Pacoima, San Pedro, and Venice's Oakwood, these are historically the only places that African Americans were allowed to settle. So when you have newcomers moving into a historically segregated neighborhood, the meaning of gentrification and the impact of race relations on that kind of situation is quite different than in another case. Since the 1970s, Latino and Asian immigration transformed LA into one of the most ethnically diverse cities in the United States. And you're seeing this everywhere. I mean, you can't go to a neighborhood in LA where you don't see the impact of immigration, whether it's in the entrepreneurial spirit or the workforce of LA or just everyday life, walking around the streets. Venice is a place where you can see this. You can see it in Oakwood. Oakwood went from being a majority African-American neighborhood to becoming a majority Latino neighborhood. So now you have this black Latino mix, and then increasingly it became a not majority but largest population white neighborhood. So now you have whites, Latinos, and African-Americans living in the Oakwood section. Bohemianism is another one. No place in LA is more famous for countercultural movements than Venice. Arts and countercultural politics have influenced the identity of the place since the 1950s. The Beat movement, which emerged in North Beach in San Francisco, Greenwich Village in New York, and Venice in Los Angeles, mostly in the canal section along the boardwalk. You had people who were engaged in both the arts and a kind of celebration of poverty for its own sake, right? And then increasingly you had this countercultural politics that emerged that influenced a kind of slow growth movement across the coast. And then homelessness. LA has the dubious distinction as the homeless capital of Los Angeles. Downtown LA, Hollywood, Santa Monica, Venice, places with many different social services, a place where you can see poverty on the streets every day, everywhere you look. So how all of these different pieces come together and mix is central, I argue, to neighborhood culture and our notions of who belongs in a place. If a place doesn't look and feel welcoming, we call it exclusive, right? I mean, if you were to drive up to Bel Air, it's a very small number of people that can go into Bel Air and say, "Oh yeah, this is me. This is where I fit in." Right? Right? I mean, you walk in, it has this daunting gate. The houses are huge, even behind additional walls. There's security cameras everywhere. You know, you can hardly see the houses. The ones you can see, there's huge dips below that just like, you know, it's something out of a movie for most of us, right? But some places have been more welcoming to groups that are labeled as outsiders, when you whether call them countercultural groups, whether you want to call it historically minority groups who weren't allowed to live in a lot of other areas. So, and then if you were to look across Los Angeles, you have these exclusive territories like Bel Air, but you also have these places where diversity exists, where you have all of these different processes that I just talked about: African American segregation, Latino and Asian immigration, bohemianism, and homelessness, and now gentrification converging right in close proximity. In the early 1920s, Harvey Zorbaugh wrote a book about Chicago that he called The Gold Coast and the Slum. It was about the near north side of Chicago. And it was about how these different groups, people of all different types of lifestyles and ways of life, settled in the same place. Well, Venice, in a sense, is a kind of 20th century, 21st century now, place that matches this kind of proximity of diversity. And I argue that the best way to see how a city works and to see all the different forces together and to see the neighborhoods, Los Angeles is very much a city of neighborhoods, right? I mean, the sprawling, you look on a map and you see the sprawling geography and people think, well, there's no such thing as the local in Los Angeles, right? It's the opposite, right? There's so much sprawl and so much expansive geography that local matters even more. People become even more attached to their local spaces. When I was living in Venice, people used to wear these t-shirts that said AWOL across the top of the shirt. And then underneath, it was AWOL. Underneath it said, always west of Lincoln, meaning Lincoln Boulevard. And it's true, right, in some sense, right? People tend to spend most of their times in the neighborhoods that they live in LA because the traffic is unbearable. And the geography is too distant. And people don't want to travel, right? So, for the most part, I will say. Anyway. So what happens in these conditions is the paradox of diversity, right? The assumption is that the proximity of diversity leads to neighborhood integration. Well, the truth is that people with different histories, different understandings and experiences in the neighborhood, and different ideas about what a neighborhood should be don't always mix. They might be living right next to each other, but they don't necessarily mix. in Oakwood, you have a sort of southern culture that emerged when African Americans moved from the South up to California to work building the canals and the pier in Venice. Having a kind of front porch culture that was typical of the South that has kind of lasted to this day. People are outside. It's part of the culture. Well, realistically, white, upper middle, and upper class people coming from the suburbs tend to have a more private lifestyle. They move into those neighborhoods, and the vision of people outside is very, in a sense, shocking to them, and they don't exactly know what to do. They build big, high fences around their properties. Some people will build 7-foot fences around their properties. I mean, literally 7-foot fences around their property. People will call the police for any activity. I went to a funeral in Oakwood that was to celebrate the life of an older resident in the neighborhood. Lived to well into his 80s. I think he died, he was 88. I mean, he had a nice long life, and there was a very big celebration. People came from all over LA that used to live in Oakwood, and before long, you had literally hundreds of African American people in the streets of Venice. Well, most people sitting here in their heads would say, well, that's okay. They're celebrating the life of a resident. All of a sudden, police started circling. And you had dozens of police cars circling. Police getting out of their cars, inquiring, what's going on in this situation? A few months later, there was a spot in the Oakwood Park where African American seniors would play dominoes and had forever. One day they went out to play dominoes, and the picnic tables where they had been playing for decades were gone, disappeared, removed from the park, because people complained they didn't want people out in the park. It was a park, right? It was the argument. So you had these competing visions, these competing cultures. What makes a community meaningful for people, right? And so the book, in a sense, tries to dissect the contestations around community and community experiences. And you can see it in all sorts of different population groups. So, I have a chapter on the Oakwood section, but also a chapter on homelessness, a chapter on the boardwalk, and a chapter on the canals, to give you a sense of how all of these different groups have navigated these processes. The book is basically about the dilemma of diversity and the difficulty of seeing the world from many different perspectives. And my sense is that to have empathy and understanding of where people are coming from and to not group people together so easily is the challenge, right? To not look at people and say that all people of the same group, whether they're homeless or whether they're gentrifiers or whether they're African Americans or whatever group that they're identified with visibly, right? Because we're talking about this notion of what's visible in culture. To not categorize them as a uniform group. So I just want to end on that and just say thank you to Skylight Books for organizing it. Thank you all for coming.